um, for many reasons. Um, Chase is a graduate of the New England Harvard program and came to us last year in the master, and it was very obvious that he was bringing a very special energy. And I had the pleasure to be his advisor all year and also to have him in the pedagogy class and to see this project that he has created that has such a potential to become a new model of education. I'm extremely, extremely excited that he will present this to you. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Bruce Brubaker from the New England Conservatory. Thank you for being with us. Please all welcome Chase Morin, the Music Alliance Project. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Marco. As you can see, my thesis, it's called the Music Alliance Project. And at the basic core of the project, it's a string quartet plus a jazz trio, piano, bass, drums. But this is actually a format, this is a musical format that has been explored quite a bit. There's a lot of precedent for this, and this project is actually not focused on the musical element, it's focused on the process of the music. And so I call it an interconnective and transformative experience bridging the gap between jazz and classical musicians. So you'll notice I'm not really talking about recording or music per se, I'm talking about an experience, specifically an experience for musicians, for jazz and classical musicians. Personally, growing up, I've been a part of two really wonderful communities, the classical and jazz communities. I've been a performer and a composer in both for many years. And as I came into this program and we started exploring the concepts of zero gravity and all these different ways of bringing music into communities and bringing communities together, the kernel of the ideas for this project started forming. And the idea was to take these two communities, jazz and classical, which have been involved with each other in Boston and throughout the world for many, many years, and to start bringing them together in a more cohesive and collaborative way. Because there are certain barriers between these cultures, and there's a lot of cross-collaboration, but there are also a lot of walls in which you have classical musicians who want to get involved with jazz and improvisation, all the concepts we talk about here, but sometimes have trouble getting into that. And vice versa, jazz musicians know more about what these classical players are playing, all this beautiful repertoire that has been written, and what kind of details they're working on, but sometimes don't know how to access this. So rather than me explain it to you in depth, I have a video to start explaining it, and then we'll continue with the details. It began as a simple question: how can we break down barriers and bridge the gap between classical musicians and jazz?
Getting a string quartet and a jazz trio to play together as a seven-headed animal. So like, it wasn't just like, oh, okay, we're gonna have a like string quartet playing like little textures around while the jazz improvise. Like, but it was like having us all, like we're all improvisers and we're all classical chamber musicians.
Right, so you're here. It was clear to me from the start that I couldn't just put these people in the same room together and hope something magical would happen. It had to go deeper. I met with each musician individually every week for 3 months, and I started teaching them about the other world. So for the jazz musicians, I taught them about classical music, and for the classical musicians, about improvisation.
I could hear myself trying very different things and being okay with it. Willingness to try anything, listening better to whether if you want to be a texture or if you want to be a main line.
So it was sort of a meeting in the middle, and not sort of a forsaking what we already knew how to do, but using what we already knew how to do to build on this new thing that we were creating.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So you're finding something.
Yeah.
So what are the challenges here?
Maintaining the key.
With the jazz musicians, Lee and Max, I talked with them about classical music.
We listened to some pieces and looked at the charts to follow along, and just kind of got an idea of what that world is like, and how little things that I found were crazy were that don't count off tunes, and just bringing in the piece just by a nod, and knowing the tempo through something like that blew my mind.
They were still there.
Yeah, because your ear doesn't realize what your ear actually does is when it hears a sound and it hears all these partials like this, it converts it into sounding like one sound. After all of these lessons, it was time to put everything together. In one of the first lessons with Audrey, we discussed what would it sound like to play music in outer space, something that's in the void, among the stars. And some beautiful music started happening when she had that image in mind. So what I did then is I took some of the details from that improvisation and I fleshed out the notes a little bit so that we could play in a larger context with the entire group. With the jazz players, I wrote a piece modeled off Mozart, and so we actually worked on taking the jazz trio format and incorporating that into the chamber setting.
So I did learn a lot in the process, and I think it gave me an extra sort of sensitivity to playing certain melodic figures, and knowing like how to blend in a different way, watching the way they breathe, watching the bow. Okay, that's where it is.
Breathing with a phrase, being able to see how fast something will be just by how the whoever's conducting or cueing or sniffing or whatever is moving their body, like that was kind of blew my mind.
I can't play jazz yet, and that wasn't the goal of this, but I feel like there's a way that I could interact with jazz musicians in a fulfilling way, rather than me sort of hanging on to random chords or just, holding people back. I feel like I can interact with jazz musicians and make something really cool, even if it's not jazz.
I'm very sorry about that.
No, it's so beautiful. I love that.
It's kind of something that I think you need to jump in and into an environment where you feel comfortable and perfectly okay, and there are a lot of great people, and this was exactly it.
We spent many hours together doing lessons, master classing different ideas, and working together, coming from different perspectives. And that's the true beauty of this project. This process can be a vehicle for change for all of these musicians. Thank you very much. Just want to introduce the musicians. Julia Connor on violin 1, Martine Thomas on viola, Yuna Kim, violin 2, Audrey Chen on the cello. All the string players are musicians at NEC, Conservatory. And then Max Ridley on bass and Lee Fish. All right. So I think the video did a good job of explaining the basic gist of this project, but I kind of want to flesh out some of the details and introduce kind of what musically happened in this project. As I mentioned, I met with each of these musicians and masterclassed ideas, talked about concepts in the other world. So with Lee and Max, we actually read through scores and we played classical repertoire and talked about different interpretations, basically getting into the mindset and the world of what these musicians deal with on a regular basis. And with all the string players, we talked about improvisation and actually using a lot of the concepts you learned with Danilo and other people and mentors in this program, things like taking language and incorporating that into their vocabulary, taking a lot of imagery and scenes in mind and incorporating that into improvisation and using the tools that they already have, because these are excellent musicians with great ears. I'm not teaching them from the beginning on how to use their instruments. I'm teaching them how to get into a frame of mind that can lead to spontaneous exploration in the moment. And so when I finally started bringing people together for this final recording project, that one served as a vehicle for channeling all these things that we learned into specific music, I didn't want to come in as a composer and say, hey, okay, here are some notes for your string players, here's some chord changes for the jazz players. I wanted to be more of a collaborative experience, something that came from the players themselves. So the music goes on a wide spectrum, everything from completely free music to music that's completely written out. The first three, Mirrors, Fire, and Echoes, are larger pieces that I quasi-composed and quasi-took from things that happened in these lessons. Because I video documented every single lesson, I was able to go back and take little pieces of improvisations that happened and flush them out for the whole group. So Mirrors actually, as I mentioned in the video, was modeled off, I took a Mozart sonata, and I basically fleshed out the details, wrote out my own notes, and was able to incorporate Lee and Max into the chamber setting. And what was beautiful about that, the string players actually started teaching them. So in rehearsals, you had the string players self-rehearsing, going over phrases, and working with Lee and Max as they would with any chamber repertoire. So they got a real closer look at how that music is put together in the classical world. For the string players, I basically dedicated a short work to each one of them that basically featured them as a soloist, as an improviser. And so Goats was for Martine, the viola player. Alone in the City was for Yuna, violin. Space was for Audrey, the cello player. And Scramble was for everyone. And Julia was actually a featured soloist in Mirrors as well. And so the last thing was the free improvisations, which were completely unwritten for everyone to do collective kind of improvisation games. So we did a few different things, like taking duos of people, having them play and interact with each other in different ways, and then handing it off to the next person. And I also put certain themes in mind. So I brought in like settings or like characters for each person to portray and improvise with. So to give you another example of what happened with the string players, the shorts that I wrote, and I want to show what I did with Yuna. This is something that just naturally happened in one of the lessons. So that was a little piece that happened. We were talking about how she was feeling that day, and she was talking about walking around downtown Boston. Her boyfriend lives in New York, so she felt very lonely, but within a large group of people, like that feeling of loneliness when you're still among a busy, crowded place with a lot of people. And so that kind of improvisation kind of came out of that feeling, and so I flushed out the notes called Alone in the City like this. It's a really short piece, not a lot of direction, a lot of it improvised, but basically Yuna had freedom to improvise over this whole thing, and I just fleshed out a few of the notes that came from that improvisation so that the whole group could play with her. And this is a little sample of that. Really incredible to me, considering she had never improvised in her life before then. I also want to show you a few little excerpts from free improvisations that happened. Again, a few different games and different exercises with improvisation that we worked with the string players and the whole group. So here's some samples from that. So, I learned a great deal out of this process too. I realized that there are a lot of commonalities between these different cultures, and there's a lot of desire, there's a lot of hunger in people to learn and to communicate with other people and to collaborate and to form communities together. And so I envisioned for this project, the reason why I put together that 7-minute video, which I will eventually condense, is because I want to show this to other people. I want to send it to organizations, to schools, to people who are interested in using this process, and to have people come in like me or others interested in this type of pedagogy, really, and come in and teach musicians to work together like this. Because I think although there's a lot of this happening in the world right now, there's also a lot of fear. I see in a lot of my colleagues, for example, at NEC, a lot of these musicians, they want to get into improvised. They're really interested in jazz musicians and all these techniques that we're using, but they take like some kind of like jazz appreciation course or that kind of thing, and they get scared off by theory and some of the details of the music. And my approach is, no, let's take the things that you know already, the tools that you have in your bag, and start fleshing it out and start exploring step by step how we can learn from each other and how you can collaborate with others. And so that's the hope that I have with this project in the future, to actually take the same process and maybe work with an orchestra, maybe work with a jazz festival and bring classical musicians there. All these types of ideas are things that I have hopes for in the future. Special thanks for all these people who are directly involved with this process, who have inspired me and helped me throughout this year, and I thank everyone who's been in our family and community this past year, because I've been completely inspired, and I don't think I would have ever come to a project or an exploration like this without all of you. So thank you so much.
Beautiful, Chase. Professor, would you like to start commenting? No. Okay. Bruno, yes, you want to.
I always go first.
Yeah.
Chase, this is quite fantastic. I could talk to you for a long time about this, but what I'm going to focus on, the music is fabulous. But about 1 minute into your presentation, it just struck me that this is exactly what Berkeley and Boston Conservatory needs to be able to meet and merge, because two different worlds, they're about to crash together. And what I would love to see is you doing an hour presentation for the board of trustees, for the presidents, for the deans, for the chairs of both schools. Thank you.
Congratulations. Yeah, great, amazing project. So I just had a couple questions. One, I saw like you were talking about going over the scores with the jazz musicians. And then in the video I saw you working with the string players. I was just wondering something more specific with the string players, like what did you teach them scales, like based on certain, I mean, you know what I mean? Could you be a little more specific with some of the things that you did with the classical musicians to get them to be able to improvise?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things I did with all of the lessons, actually, is I had them play some of their repertoire that they were working on currently. So for a lot of the string players, they were working on like Bach, like suites or like solo pieces. And so, but often they were still working on them. So they were actually making mistakes. So there were times when someone would be playing through a piece and they would forget some of the notes. And I would say, no, don't stop. I want you to continue playing. And so we actually started from there. We started from what is the process of making a mistake and how can you actually use that as a vehicle for improvisation, for making something new happen. And then as lessons progressed, we started talking about different moods, about different characters and how to bring out things, how to react. And so it was a lot of abstract ideas of like, okay, here's a phrase. And I would literally say something like, hey, how's your day going? Can you play that sentence on your instrument? Things that we talk about a lot with Danilo. And things like that started turning into conversations, which started turning into explorations in how to actually tell a story through improvisation. And we did talk a little bit about theory. There were times in which I'd interject, like there was one clip in the middle of the video where I was with Audrey and I played that line on the piano up, and I was showing her, oh, how do I put a different key on top of the harmony, for example, because I noticed she was playing very in the key, very safe diatonicist. I was like, no, you don't need to worry about that. Like, check out this whole new world. can. So there was some of the theory involved, but I tried to stick as much away from that and focus on the abstract ideas of the mentality of improvising with these musicians. And I think that's what kind of clicked for them, because they all have really great ears, and they're already hearing these melodies in their heads, you know, and they have amazing facility. It's just the mindset of, okay, I'm not just playing notes and, oh no, am I in C major, G major, F major, but I'm playing a city, you know, I'm playing a jellyfish now, or these types of things that they really connected with.
Yeah, because all of that makes us, I think, well, makes me think about that question of, is there a difference between jazz and creative improvising? You know what I mean? Like, I think that's a question that a lot of people ponder, and myself included. You know, everybody has probably different feelings about that. I'm curious as to your take on that.
Yeah, well, yes. I think Julia actually really nailed it in the video. She said, I'm not a jazz musician, but I feel like I can interact with jazz musicians now. And that was like kind of the goal of the project, was jazz is actually really a style. It has a whole tradition. There are certain stylistic elements involved with it, right? But some of the mindset that was pioneered within the jazz tradition of creativity, improvising, composing on the spot, that kind of thing is what I was really working on with the musicians. So I purposely strayed away from that. And I did touch a little bit. There are a few lessons I actually talked about the blues, for example, because I did want them to have a little kernels of like what that means. So I play them different, like Delta City Blues, like just different like things within that tradition, and talk a little bit about groove. But that's a whole lifelong pursuit, and that, you know, I had 3 months with them. So really it was more the mindset, the freedom to be able to start interacting with jazz musicians that I cared about.
How often did you get together? Like if you were to put it into, I don't know,
Yeah,
hours, days?
so I met with them for 3 months, and I met with each person individually every week. So each person, by the end, I met individually about 8 times, and then the whole group met about 5 times together. Yeah.
That's great.
Chase, amazing work. I'm listening. I'm, coming from a country where we didn't really study jazz in that sense, like in school. I relate very deeply to this work that you did. Actually, it's a strong case. If you look at the history of the music, you're making a strong case that we are forgetting something about education that needs to be keep in track, which is, when you look at the fundamentals of learning music, like jazz, let's say, there was no jazz method. It was just classical and an assimilation of this through a voice that came into all the influences you had. So you're reminding America of what America actually was at the beginning of the turn of the last century. And I think it's important to remember the people like Bird, Warren with Debussy and Stravinsky. That's a lot of people don't know that. I mean, and that Duke Ellington was constantly studying the classical, and that Louis Armstrong got his sound from Enrico Caruso, trying to imitate Enrico Caruso's Signe Vachey. A lot of people don't know this. So you are touching upon a very, a huge point that now start to arise question like, is the education, the way we are viewing, is so independent from each other? This is jazz, this is classical, as being healthy for the music and the development, and you are showing that no. You're making a strong case to say it's wrong the way to think this way, because it's not about that, and the way you created, and to expand on a word that I think is good word, like not call it jazz, but really call it compromising, composition and improvisation. The word jazz is not it doesn't mean anything really. It actually has negative connotation when you look at it, and people look at jazz player like say, oh, he's just playing a bunch of back tricks that he learned. And classical musicians feel like, okay, I'm not a part of this. You're making a case like, no, we are, we have a mission together. And I know Bruce has been making this case for years at the conservatory. I had the pleasure of working with him, and I saw him bridging. You are making a bridge. This is an important work, and I agree with you. This should be presented to the board of trustees And this is the way that we should embrace education. This is the present, this is the future, and we gotta stop thinking like, what kind of musician are you? I'm classical. No, you're a musician. You make music first. You don't make classical music, you make music. I'm a jazz musician. No, I'm a musician. So thank you for making such an important contribution to the field and reminding us that this music maybe should be called Afro-American classical music.
Thank you, Danilo.
Bravo. I love this project. I think that you did amazing work. I want to ask you about some of the limits, though, because I watched a lot of this up close, at least at the very end, and it did seem like it was a fragile interaction. And what I observed, you mentioned this already, is that I think on both sides, if there's sides, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear in our world today anyway. But it seemed like to me, I could see it very clearly on the classical musicians, that they were really afraid of being embarrassed, of being revealed not to be really such musicians after all as they might imagine that they are. I mean, can you say anything about that? Because, I think in the amount of time you had here, you went a long, long way. What would be next? And is there some limitation, or how do you adjust those problems?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what's next, I hope we can get rid of that fear. That's really kind of, if I had to pinpoint a word that I want to remove from this project, that would be fear. Because you're right, it's crazy because some of the lessons with people, for example, with Yuna, who you saw on the violin, the first time I sat down with her and said, okay, let's play. Started playing something, and I played an entire 4 minutes or 5 minutes. She never started playing a note, and then I finished and I said, "How come you didn't play?" She's like, "Oh, I don't know what to do." She was literally feared into non-action, into not doing anything. And for a lot of these musicians here, that was the case. That was the case where they literally because coming from an improvising world, it seems so natural, okay, touch your instrument, just make some sound. But for them, it's like, no, what sound? I need to know what I'm making first before I do that. So that was the first, the initial barrier. And I think part of my energy, acting a little goofy, having fun, that kind of thing was a catalyst out of that mindset. Because when you see someone else making a fool of themselves and doing strange things, you're like, oh, okay, it's okay if I do that too. And so, as Audrey kind of mentioned, having, first of all, a comfortable environment where you don't feel afraid to make mistakes and you feel like you can do anything, and people are like, yeah, that was interesting. What was that? That was a cool mistake there. That's kind of the environment that I was really trying to create with this project initially. And so for the future of this project, I hope, I could imagine, these are all young players, NEC, who are down for experimentation. But, just going into an orchestra, for example, as I did in Louisville, there were players there who were much older, who had very specific views on what music should be, and that would be a much tougher hurdle, I think, for them. And so that's kind of a long vision. Wow, what if I could reach them as well? That would be a hope of mine.
One more thing. So I wondered also if you, I'm not quite exactly sure how I would categorize your role in this. It strikes me that any kind of a project like this depends on some kind of wacky charisma that you have. But no, it's true. But how many people could do that? So or could anybody really do that? And then is it a little bit like being, I don't like the word very much, but is it like being the auteur or the director of a film who in some cases choose untrained actors? We know some of those movies that are fantastic, and the actors are though actually sort of used. And they come into the film in a naive condition, and usually they have no further career after the movie's over because that's it. But they create a fantastic artistic product, And I know that you and I already talked about this a little bit, and you mentioned right at the top that you thought of it more as a process. But I mean, is there any level there where you, I'm not going to ask if you feel guilty, but if you feel like, yes, I'm sort of pulling the right strings here to get these things to happen, you know, how does that translate into a future for the people that are involved?
Yeah, I actually kind of feel like it's similar to the process of this institute in general.
Maybe.
You know, I feel like what has been created here is we have a bunch of students who are learning new concepts, who are being enlightened in a certain way to approach music and the world in a different way. And, you know, we're all going to have different paths. Some of us are going to continue on, you know, preaching or telling about these ideas, and I think it's sort of a trickle-down experience that happens and is contagious and infectious. And so I hope, like, one telling example is actually about halfway through the process, just coincidentally, Martine, the viola player, there was some event through Harvard, because she's a dual student there, that she ended up playing with Max, who is the bassist, the jazz bassist here. And it was completely by coincidence, and they were like, oh, wow, we know each other from Chase's project. We're playing together now, and kind of some improvised material, that kind of thing. And so that, to me, is like what I hope. I hope that I can go in and impact these people in a certain way that now they have the tools necessary to go and continue collaborations and projects like this in the future with other people.
A couple things. I just wanted to add a couple things. Could you think about writing a children curriculum? And then second, an advice is a lot of the challenges with string comes from the bowing. You know, they come from, you know, they don't have that rhythmical intensity as we know it. So maybe adding some drum circle before they get to the strings. That's all. That's what I would.
First, what Danilo said about teaching young children, I'm going to relate a story from my youngest daughter's first piano lesson. And this wasn't 1950, this was 10 years ago. So she took a piano lesson, and we said, play the little melody you made up the other day. So she started the piano lesson with, we're playing this little melody. The piano teacher went, okay, enough of that. Where is middle C? And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for training. My other question to you, how, classical music obviously was improvised partially through history. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know you know a lot about that, or.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, for example, by the way, I studied with Bruce for 4 years at New England Conservatory, classical piano. And so this is something that was brought up quite a bit, which is basically before mid-19th century, the respected, most professional performers in the Western classical European sphere were improvisers. Beethoven is known for ferocious improvisations. Cadenzas were often improvised. A lot of this music was improvised from the start, and that's something kind of that's been lost in the tradition in the past century or so. And yeah, so that's a real connection there. And I've even some of these lessons we talked about taking those pieces and taking like a cadenza moment or a place where actually that would have been improvised in the tradition originally, and I talked to players, hey, what would it be like to add your own ornaments, to add your own notes to that kind of thing? So yeah, there is definitely a precedent there.
You know, I was also thinking about the social impact of like it being like a blueprint in a way, you know, because it's always felt like an us and them thing. You know what I mean? And like every time I've played with an orchestra, they vibe me big time. You know, before we hit a note. You know, I find myself like, hey, how you doing? You know, and trying to just be extra friendly just to have, you know, and that's a whole cultural thing that, you know, needs to be broken down, but not just between jazz and classical musicians. I think it's all kinds of musicians and beyond. So this could be a blueprint for moving, you know, people, together in general. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing that what I was really, really happy to see was that the very beginning of this process, I interviewed everyone actually. And so I actually asked all the players, like, hey, string players, what do you think of jazz players, musicians? What do they know? And someone like, oh, my boyfriend's a jazz musician. He's kind of wild, like that. And the jazz players were talking about, oh, they're maybe kind of stiff sometimes. I get strange. Like there are some really interesting things that came out about these interactions, right? And by the end of the process, I think just that, like, even if these string players never improvise again in their lives, and even these, Max and Lee never interact with classical musicians, I think they now have new perspective on what those worlds are like, and these, like, apart from their just like those like superficial kind of stereotypes.
Well, Chase, we've been talking so much during the semester about the project. I don't want to add more, but I like the fact that you said at the beginning when you described the project that you really create an experience, which is totally what you're doing. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of what Giovanni, when Giovanni talks about jazz, and he says, I love this quote of him, he said, jazz is not what, jazz is how. And I think you really create an experience where you're breaking down these barriers. And regarding what you were saying about the future, you talk about the orchestra in Louisville, talking about older musicians, but I really think the future would be working with younger musicians, like with you, children, like Danilo say, or like youth orchestra, where they still don't have that, those boundaries so set, and you can really create the experience where all of a sudden they don't see boundaries and they just see what you want them to see. Amazing. Chase, Morin, beautiful.